The rental agreement slid across the mahogany dining table, stopping right next to the gravy boat. It was Christmas dinner. 23 people were crammed into the room, and my daughter, Clara, was looking at me like I was a stranger who had overstayed his welcome in a cheap motel. She did not look at my face. She just stared at the piece of paper, her fingers tapping the edge of her wine glass. My name is Charles Vance. I am 58 years old, and at that exact moment, I was standing at the head of the table in a stained kitchen apron, holding a carving knife that had belonged to my father. Beside Clara, her husband, Victor Marsh, leaned back in his chair, a small, smug smile playing on his lips. His business partners from his design firm were sitting near him, dressed in their expensive, pressed shirts, laughing a little too loud, drinking my wine, and acting like they owned the place. Clara's voice was clear, carrying over the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation. She said that starting next month, if I wanted to keep staying in the room at the end of the hall, I would need to contribute $2,200 a month. She called it a reasonable contribution. She said the house was not a free retirement home, that I used their utilities, ate their food, and that I was not really contributing anything anyway. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. 23 guests suddenly stopped chewing. Victor smirked, taking a slow sip of his Cabernet, and added that if I could not afford it, I should start packing before New Year's because they were not going to carry a dead-weight old man. I did not say a word. I did not yell. I did not throw a fit. I just quietly laid down the carving knife, untied my linen apron, and folded it into a neat square, placing it on the sideboard. I knew they thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought a retired craftsman with a modest pension had nowhere else to go. What they did not know was that the ground Victor was so proud of standing on, the house they lived in, the very table they were eating off, and the company logo printed at the top of that rental agreement belonged to me. I had packed my suitcase 3 weeks earlier, and as I walked down the hall to my small room, I knew that by the next morning, their comfortable lives were going to fall apart. Then Clara tapped her wineglass with her spoon. The room went quiet fast. Dad, her voice came out bright, almost cheerful, like she was about to make a toast. Since everyone is here, I want to clear something up. I looked at her from across the table. My hands were still on the serving dish. Starting next month, she said, if you want to keep staying in the room at the end of the hall, you will need to contribute $1,800 a month. That is just rent. We have been carrying you for 3 years, and honestly, it is time for a change. My chest tightened, 58 years old, and I had to remind myself not to show what I was feeling. Not here, not in front of these people. Not yet. Clara slid the piece of paper across the table toward me. Room rental agreement, it said at the top. Sign tonight or start packing. I looked down at the paper, and that is when I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something quieter and colder than anger. In the top left corner of that document was a small, clean navy logo, a stylized oak tree with roots that spread into the shape of a house foundation. It was my logo, the logo I had designed with Martha in 1989 on a paper napkin at a diner in Virginia. It was the logo of Vance Woodworks, the company I had spent 4 decades building from a single rented workshop into an enterprise that now owned this house, this furniture, this chandelier, and the ground underneath Victor's expensive shoes. My daughter had just handed me a lease agreement printed on my own company's letterhead, demanding I pay rent to live in a house I owned. You are right, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Nobody should live off someone else's property without paying their way. I looked at Clara, really looked at her, and added, starting tomorrow, we will all be doing exactly that. I walked to my room and closed the door. The paper stayed on the table, unsigned. Later that night, after the voices faded and the house settled, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the room Clara had given me. It was the smallest one, the one at the end of the hall with the single window that faced the neighbor's brick wall. I opened my nightstand drawer and pulled out a folder I had put together 3 weeks earlier. Inside was a copy of the original corporate lease agreement for this property. The market rate was $7,900 a month. Clara's rate was $600 a month, listed as an internal family accommodation. I heard Clara's voice in my head. You are not really contributing anything. My throat burned, but I refused to let it become tears. I set the folder aside and stood up. I crossed to the closet and slid open the door. The suitcase stayed where I had put it 3 weeks ago, already packed. Everything I needed fit in half a bag. A man who had spent 4 decades building things learned early what actually mattered and what was just furniture. Then I noticed the wall. The photograph of Martha and me on the day we opened our first workshop was gone. I found the frame in the recycling bin by the kitchen door, buried under wrapping paper. The back panel had been pried open. The small yellow envelope Martha had tucked inside years ago, the one she told me to open only when I needed it most, was gone. My heart dropped. Martha had told me once that she kept the most important things in places the wrong people would never think to look. Standing there in that small room, holding the empty frame, I started to understand that she had known something I had not wanted to believe. I sat on the edge of that narrow bed in the darkness, staring at the empty picture frame in my calloused hands. The room was cold, the window glass vibrating slightly with the winter wind howling outside. I could hear the muffled sounds of the party winding down downstairs. The business partners were leaving, their loud voices carrying through the driveway, engines starting, tires crunching over the gravel. Then came the sound of the front door closing and the deadbolt clicking shut. Clara and Victor were alone now, likely celebrating their little victory in the kitchen over another glass of wine, thinking they had finally put the old man in his place. I had been on my feet since 5 that morning. The turkey went into the oven before sunrise, the way my late wife, Martha, always did it. Low heat, butter under the skin, a handful of fresh thyme tucked in close. I had made this same bird every Christmas for 40 years. It did not matter whose kitchen I was standing in, but this year I was standing in mine, though nobody at that table knew that part. By 7 in the evening, the dining room was packed. Victor's business associates sat near the head of the table. They were men in their 30s who talked about margins and acquisitions, like they were fighting a war. Clara floated between them like she was hosting a charity gala, her dress sharp, her smile sharper. I stayed in my lane, apron on, serving spoon in hand, moving between the kitchen and the table the way a good host does. Except nobody was calling me the host. Victor was deep into one of his stories, gesturing with his wine glass. "I am telling you," he said, leaning back in his chair, with the ease of a man who had never once doubted himself. "The design contract we just closed is the kind of deal that changes things. 5 years ago, I was sketching floor plans in a studio apartment. Now look at this place." He swept his hand around the room, pointing at the crystal chandelier, the crown molding, and the wide plank hardwood floors I had paid $18,000 to install back in 2019. "Built it from the ground up," Victor said. "That is what happens when you outwork everybody else." I set a dish of roasted potatoes down on the table without a word. My jaw was tight, but I kept my face easy. 23 people in this room, and not one of them knew that the ground Victor was so proud of building on belonged to my company. I looked at the cardboard backing of the frame. The small metal tabs had been bent back roughly, scratch marks showing where a knife or a fingernail had pried them open. Martha's envelope was definitely gone. She had hidden it there the day she came home from her final hospital visit in 2015. She had held my hand, her eyes clear despite the morphine, and whispered, "Charlie, when they try to take what we built, you look in the workshop photo. The wrong people won't think to look behind our beginning." I had kept that frame on my dresser for 10 years, never once prying it open, respecting her memory too much to disturb what she had touched. But Clara and Victor had no such reservations. They had gone through my things while I was out buying groceries or taking my afternoon walks, searching for anything they could use. It was a strange feeling, realizing your own child had been rifling through your drawers. I did not feel angry. The anger had burned out weeks ago when I first discovered what they were planning. Now there was only a deep, hollow disappointment. I stood up and set the empty frame on the nightstand. I reached into my closet, pulled out my pre-packed leather suitcase, and checked the contents one last time. 3 changes of clothes, a few old family photo albums that had not been looted, my personal journal, and my woodworking notebook. The rest of my life was already elsewhere, waiting for me in a small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of Richmond, a place I had rented 3 weeks ago under my own name. I sat back down and opened the manila folder I had kept hidden under the mattress. It contained the corporate lease documents for this very house. The property was officially owned by Vance Woodworks. In 2017, after the business had grown to 3 regional locations, the company purchased this estate as a corporate asset. When Clara married Victor in 2018, they asked if they could lease it. I wanted to help my daughter start her new life, so I agreed to a special lease. The document listed it as an internal family accommodation, setting the rent at a mere $600 a month, while the actual market value of the property was $7,900. I had even paid for the property taxes and major renovations out of the corporate account. For 3 years, they had lived here in luxury, paying less than a tenth of what the house was worth, while Victor built his design firm and Clara bought designer dresses. And yet tonight, they had sat at my table, looked me in the eyes, and demanded I pay $2,200 a month just to sleep in the small guest room at the end of the hall. The silence of the house allowed me to think clearly, contrasting Clara's childhood humbleness with her current arrogance. I recalled the marble bathrooms, the custom cabinetry, and the professional chef's kitchen they enjoyed daily. All of those upgrades had been billed directly to the corporate account under the guise of tenant improvements, which I had approved out of a father's blind love. I closed the folder, put it in my bag, and waited for the clock to strike midnight. My departure would be silent, but the legal storm that followed would be loud. The year was 1983, and Richmond, Virginia was experiencing one of the coldest winters on record. Martha and I were 27 years old, recently married, and foolish enough to believe that hard work alone could solve any problem. We had managed to scrape together exactly $1, $100 from my savings as an apprentice carpenter and her shifts at the local diner. With that money, we signed a lease on a 400-square-foot industrial bay in a dilapidated brick building near the railroad tracks. The roof was made of corrugated sheet metal that rattled like a machine gun whenever the wind blew, and the concrete floor was so cold it felt like ice through the soles of our boots. We could not afford the security deposit on a real apartment and the workshop lease at the same time. So we made a choice. We bought a thick green canvas tarp, folded it in half on the floor in the corner of the workshop, and slept there. We used our winter coats as blankets and my old toolbox as a headrest. I remember that first night vividly. The smell of sawdust, machine oil, and damp concrete was thick in the air. I lay there shivering, staring up at the dark ceiling, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Martha must have felt me shaking because she reached out under the coats, took my hand, and squeezed it. Her fingers were cold, but her voice was warm and absolutely steady. "Charlie," she said, "we need to install better lighting over the workbench tomorrow. I can't do the bookkeeping in the dark." I looked at her, her dark eyes reflecting the faint light from the street lamp outside the window. "Martha," I whispered, "we don't even have any customers yet. We don't have any books to keep." She smiled, a small, stubborn expression that I would grow to love more than life itself over the next 30 years. "We will," she said. "Get the lights set up. The customers will follow the work." So, I got the lights set up. I worked 14 hours a day, building simple cedar chests and pine bookshelves, while Martha kept her job at the diner to pay for our groceries and lumber. Our first real order came 8 weeks later. A family from a few streets over wanted a solid oak dining table with 6 matching chairs. The husband, a stern man named Arthur, shook my hand and paid a deposit of $150. It was the most money we had seen in months. I spent 11 days straight on that table, selecting each board of white oak, cutting the mortise and tenon joints by hand, and sanding the top until my fingers were raw and bleeding. Every evening after a shift, Martha would come to the shop. She would sit on a wooden stool under the fluorescent light I had installed, opened a ledger she had borrowed from the local library, and taught herself double-entry bookkeeping from a textbook with a torn cover. I would look up from my sanding and see her frowning at the pages, her pencil scratching numbers into the columns. "You're going to wear out the graphite," I teased her one night. She did not look up. "Column A is what we make," she said. "Column B is what we spend. Right now, column B is winning, but column A is catching up. 3 more orders like this oak table, Charlie, and we break even for the month. To save money on materials, Martha would walk down to the timber yards during her lunch break, negotiating discounts on offcuts that I could use for smaller items. She spent hours sweeping the floor and sorting through wood shavings to extract salvageable nails. She never let a single resource go to waste. During the hot summer of 1987, when the workshop felt like a tin oven, and we had no air conditioning, George Miller and I would work drenched in sweat. Martha would arrive with fresh lemonade in mason jars, sitting with us on the workbench, talking about the future with a brightness that made the heat bearable. She kept us focused when we wanted to quit. When we delivered that table, the client's wife actually cried. She ran her hands over the smooth oak top, looking at the tight joints, and said it was the most beautiful piece of furniture she had ever seen. I felt my chest swell with a pride that had nothing to do with money. On the drive back in our battered station wagon, Martha reached over and placed her hand over mine on the gear shift. Her palms were calloused from helping me sand the chair legs the night before, but she did not complain. "One down," she said. "One down," I agreed. Slowly, the work did follow. We bought our first professional table saw in 1985. We hired our first employee in 1986, a quiet man named George Miller, who was only 20 at the time but had a natural feel for grain matching. George was a man of few words, but he worked with the same precision I did, and he quickly became more than an employee. He became family. By 1989, we had outgrown the small 400-square-foot bay and moved into a larger 2,000-square-foot warehouse. We were no longer sleeping on tarps. We had bought a modest two-bedroom house, and Martha was pregnant with Clara. It was during that transition that we officially incorporated the business. We sat in a diner on a Tuesday evening, drinking cheap coffee, trying to design a logo. Martha took a blue ballpoint pen and drew a tree on a paper napkin. The trunk was thick, and the roots wrapped around the base of a house foundation. "A tree that holds up a home," she had said, looking at me. "That's what we are building, Charlie." We called the company Vance Woodworks. We registered the logo, and that napkin stayed in Martha's jewelry box for the rest of her life. 3 decades later, that same logo was printed on the lease agreement Clara used to demand rent from me. Clara was born in the spring of 1990, during a week when the workshop was flooded with orders for custom office furniture. I remember running back and forth between the hospital and the warehouse, my hands stained with walnut stain and my heart beating fast. When I first held her, she was so small her head fit in the palm of my hand. I swore right then that she would never have to sleep on a canvas tarp or shiver through the winter the way her mother and I had. I wanted to build a fortress of security around her. By the time Clara was 6, she had made the workshop her playground. Every day after school, she would ride her small red bicycle down the service road, park it against the warehouse brick wall, and march inside with the absolute authority of a child who knew she was loved. She would walk past the buzzing table saws, wave to George Miller, and climb up onto the tall wooden stool beside my workbench. "What are you making, Dad?" she would ask, her blue eyes wide. "A cabinet, sweetheart," I would say, "or a chair or a desk." She would watch me work, the curls of wood falling around her shoes, and reach out to touch the raw lumber. "It's warm," she said one afternoon, looking up in surprise. I laid my hand over hers on the cedar board. "Wood remembers the forest, Clara," I told her. "It holds the heat of the sun long after the tree is cut. A good craftsman respects that heat." She scrunched up her nose, thinking about it. "Does it remember us too when we touch it?" I smiled and kissed the top of her head. "I think it does," I said. Martha appeared in the office doorway then, her ledger tucked under her arm, watching us with that quiet, contented smile that always made the warehouse feel like a home. To keep Clara entertained during the long afternoons, I built her a miniature workbench in the corner of the office, equipped with plastic tools and scrap pieces of pine. She would spend hours sanding wood blocks beside her mother's desk, mimicking Martha's serious expression as she filed paper receipts into folders. We were a team of 3, and those years were the happiest of my life. As the years went by, the business kept growing, but the world was changing. We moved from hand tools to CNC machines, and our client list expanded from local families to corporate offices across the state. Martha handled the finances with a precision that kept us out of debt, even during the economic downturns. She was the anchor of Vance Woodworks. I was the hands, but she was the mind. In 2005, Clara went off to college in Boston to study marketing. She went to see the city, to move in circles that did not smell of sawdust and varnish. I paid her tuition in full, writing the checks from the corporate account. I wanted her to have every advantage. But when she returned for holidays, I noticed a shift. During her sophomore year, she began introducing us to her wealthy roommate's parents, calling me father instead of dad, and emphasizing our corporate volume rather than our craft. It was a subtle distance, a quiet embarrassment of the sawdust on my clothes. I remember writing a check for her semester abroad in Florence, Italy, $14,500 for a few months of art history and marketing classes. She sent back postcard photos of marble statues and piazzas, but never once asked how the workshop was doing or if I had any new projects. When she came home that summer, she had a new wardrobe and a sharp, dismissive way of speaking about our town. I could see the division growing between us, a wide canyon built of my silence and her ambition. Martha and I just smiled through it, hoping it was a passing phase of youth, but the seeds of status-seeking had already been planted deep in her mind. She did not visit the workshop anymore. The smell of cedar, which she had loved as a child, now made her wrinkle her nose. She talked about brand positioning, social capital, and lifestyle design. She looked at the old flannel shirts I wore and the dust on my boots with a silent, polite disapproval. She had met people who did not work with their hands, people who made money by moving numbers on screens, and she wanted to be like them. In 2009, Martha was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. The doctors were polite but direct. It was aggressive. I felt the world tilt on its axis. The fortress of security I had spent 25 years building suddenly felt like a house of cards. I wanted to close the shop, to spend every second by her side, but Martha would not hear of it. She sat at her office desk with a wool blanket over her lap, her hair gone from the chemotherapy, arguing with our accountant about depreciation schedules with the same sharp clarity she had always possessed. "Charlie," she told me one afternoon, when I tried to take the ledger from her hands, "the business doesn't stop because I'm sick. You need to know how these systems work. You need to know the safeguards. I am not leaving you alone in the dark." For 3 years, she fought the disease, and for 3 years she spent her good days teaching me the administrative side of the company. She showed me where the deeds were kept, how the corporate trusts were structured, and how the employee ownership shares were allocated. She was preparing me for a future she knew she would not share. It was the hardest work we had ever done together, and every line she wrote in those ledgers was a testament to a love that was practical, durable, and built to last. Martha passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in March of 2015, just as the first green shoots of spring were breaking through the frozen soil. The sun was coming through our bedroom window, warming the sheets, and her hand was in mine. She did not say anything dramatic at the end. She just looked at me with those steady, dark eyes, squeezed my fingers once, and let go. I sat there holding her cold hand for 3 hours, unable to move, unable to accept that the voice that had guided me for 32 years was gone. George Miller was the one who drove me home from the hospital. He did not speak. George understood that some silences were too heavy for words. He left his truck engine running in my driveway, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "You gonna be all right, Charlie?" he asked. "No," I said honestly, "but I'll get through the day." George nodded once, his jaw tight. "I'll handle the morning shift at the shop. You take the week." "Take the week, Charlie." I took the week, but by the following Monday, I knew I could not go back to the way things were. The warehouse was filled with Martha's presence, her empty desk, her neat handwriting in the filing cabinets, the coffee mug she had left on the windowsill. It was too much to bear. I called George into the office and told him I wanted to step back from the day-to-day operations. I was 47 years old, and I felt like I had lived 3 lifetimes. I did not want to retire completely, but I wanted to be invisible. George looked at me for a long time, his gray eyes searching my face. "You sure about this, Charlie? People in the industry are going to think you're giving up. Let them think what they want," I said. "I built the furniture for the wood, George, not for the name on the building. You run the floor. You handle the clients. I will stay on as the majority shareholder, but I want my name off the daily operations." George studied me, then gave a short, firm nod. All right, but I'm calling you every Friday for lunch, whether you like it or not. I'd expect nothing less, I told him. During those Friday lunches at the diner down the street, George and I would talk about the business, but we also talked about our families. George's kids were grown and had moved to Ohio, and he was as lonely as I was. He was the only one who understood that my retirement wasn't about leisure, it was about survival. Working with wood in my small garage was the only way I could feel close to Martha without being crushed by her absence. George would sit there in his grease-stained work shirt, eating his Salisbury steak, and tell me about the apprentices we were training. He kept the work alive, reminding me that the craft wasn't just about furniture, it was about the people who made it. Those lunches were a lifeline, a weekly bridge back to the world of living things when I was drowning in my own grief. Before her illness took her completely, Martha had worked with our corporate attorney, Rebecca Finch, to restructure our corporate bylaws. She added a critical safeguard to protect the employees. Any sale or major transfer of Vance Woodworks required a 2-3 majority vote from a council of 7 long-term workers. She made me promise that I would never bypass this council. I had agreed, knowing she was right. That contract lay sealed in the corporate records, a silent shield she had built around the people who had built the company with us. So, George became the public face of Vance Woodworks. I moved out of our family home, which held too many memories of Martha, and rented a quiet apartment downtown. I spent my days working on old, personal projects in a small garage space I rented, away from the big machines and the corporate accounts. To the outside world, Charles Vance had retired, leaving his company to be managed by his longtime associate. Only George, our corporate attorney Rebecca Finch, and the bank knew that I still held 71% of the shares. Clara was 25 then, working for a boutique marketing firm in Richmond. She seemed relieved when I stepped back. She told her friends that her father had retired to focus on his hobbies, making it sound like I was a wealthy eccentric rather than a tired carpenter who could not stand the smell of his own workshop without crying. I did not correct her. I wanted her to be happy, to feel proud of her family's status, even if that status was built on calluses and grief she had never experienced. In the spring of 2018, Clara met Victor Marsh. She brought him to Sunday dinner 6 weeks later. Victor was 30, a commercial interior designer who had just started his own firm, Victor Marsh Design LLC. He arrived in a tailored jacket, had a firm handshake, and smiled with a level of confidence that felt practiced. He spent the evening asking me detailed questions about my retirement, the structure of Vance Woodworks, and whether I still had a say in the company's financial decisions. I kept my answers simple. I told him I was just a retired carpenter, that George Miller ran the show, and that I preferred to keep my life quiet. Victor's eyes had brightened when I said that. He nodded smoothly, filing the information away. I felt a small, cold twitch in the back of my mind, a warning sign that I chose to ignore. Clara was looking at him with an adoring expression that I had not seen on her face since she was a little girl. She looked happy. She looked like she had found the life she wanted. I told myself I was just being an overprotective father, a lonely widower who did not want to let his daughter go. So, I welcomed Victor into the family. I did not know that by doing so, I was opening the door to the people who would try to tear down everything Martha and I had built. Clara and Victor were married in the summer of 2018. It was a lavish affair, held at a historic estate in Williamsburg, that Clara had insisted on. She wanted the best of everything, the imported flowers, the 5-tier cake, the chamber orchestra playing during the cocktail hour. I stood in the background, wearing a new suit George Miller had helped me pick out, feeling like a ghost at my own daughter's celebration. I wrote a check for $45,000 to cover the wedding expenses from my personal account, and when Clara thanked me, she did it with a quick, distracted hug before running back to her new, wealthy friends. Victor was in his element, shaking hands, making toasts, and acting as if he had financed the entire event himself. I watched him closely that night, noticing the way he managed to introduce himself to every prominent business owner in the room, dropping names with a smooth efficiency that made me feel uneasy. Before the wedding, Clara and I had a brief conversation in the dressing room. She was looking at herself in the ornate mirror, adjusting her lace veil. "Dad," she had said without turning around, I hope you won't wear those old work boots to the ceremony. Victor's partners are very particular about presentation. I had looked down at my hands, clean but stained permanently with walnut oil, and felt a quiet ache. I told her I would wear the dress shoes George bought with me. She had nodded satisfied and went back to checking her makeup. It was a small moment, but it was the first time I realized that my presence in her life was becoming something she needed to manage, rather than something she valued. She wanted the money from my decades of labor, but she did not want the sawdust that came with it. The Williamsburg estate was surrounded by manicured gardens and brick pathways. Clara's friends, a group of young marketing executives and designers, stood in clusters sipping champagne. They talked about summer homes in Maine and investment portfolios, their voices high and bright. When Clara introduced me to a few of them, she described me as a retired designer, glossing over my years as a carpenter. I saw Victor watching us from the bar, his eyes tracking Clara's movements with a cool, calculating look. He saw her as his ticket into Richmond's upper class, and she saw him as the partner who would help her get there. After the wedding, they settled into a rented townhouse downtown, but within 6 months, Victor began complaining about the rent and the lack of space for his design firm. Clara called me one evening, her voice filled with a careful, rehearsed anxiety. "Dad," she said, "Victor's business needs a professional space to meet clients. We can't keep living like this. It is holding him back. I had always wanted to support my daughter, so I told her about the estate on River Road that Vance Woodworks had purchased in 2017 as a corporate investment. The property was a beautiful 4-bedroom house on 2 acres of land, with a market value rent of $7,900 a month. I told Clara they could live there under an internal family accommodation lease for just $600 a month. She cried with relief, thanking me repeatedly. I thought I was giving them a head start. I did not realize I was giving Victor a platform to build his schemes. To make matters worse, Victor's firm, Victor Marsh Design LLC, was struggling to stay afloat. He had been chasing a $100,000 commercial design contract for months, spending thousands on client dinners, high-end presentations, and business travel, all billed to accounts he could barely cover. Clara, economic status was her obsession, and she was spending $2,000 on designer outfits and spa visits, trying to maintain the appearance of a wealthy designer's wife among her social circle. I saw the bills arriving at the house, though I said nothing. I kept my observations quiet, noting how they were living on borrowed time and my generosity. The River Road estate itself was a masterpiece of classic architecture. I had spent months in 2017 overseeing the restoration of the Cherrywood Library and the installation of the custom oak stairs. It was meant to be a company asset that would appreciate in value, not a playground for Victor's social climbing. But when I moved in, I saw how they had treated the space. They had replaced my handmade furniture with trendy, mass-produced pieces from Italian showrooms, treating my decades of craftsmanship as outdated junk. I stayed in the small guest room, at the end of the hall, which had a simple twin bed and a chest of drawers I had built in my apprentice days. That room was my only sanctuary, the only place that still smelled of cedar, instead of Victor's expensive cologne and Clara's lavender room sprays. I moved in that November with 2 suitcases, telling myself I was just being a father. I should have listened to the warning signs. I believed that by staying close I could somehow guide Clara back to the values Martha and I had taught her. But the pull of Victor's world was already too strong. The River Road property was more than just a house. It was a physical representation of my life's work. I had selected the site myself in 2017, admiring the way the light fell through the old oak trees in the late afternoon. Vance Woodworks had paid $1,200,000 for the land and the initial construction. I spent weeks working with the architects, ensuring the timber framing was done correctly and the joints were tight. It was meant to be a quiet corporate retreat or a high-value asset we could sell if the market turned. But when Clara and Victor moved in, they acted as if they had inherited a royal palace. They hired a landscaper to cut down 2 of the silver maples I had planted, replacing them with modern stone pathways and boxwood hedges. It was a small change, but it felt like a violation of the quiet beauty Martha and I had always valued. The first few months of living in the River Road estate were quiet. I stayed out of Victor's way, spending my time in the kitchen preparing meals or working on small wooden toys in the garage. Victor was polite, but it was a cold, formal kind of politeness. He would greet me in the morning, ask how I was doing, and then immediately turn his attention to his phone. But by the spring of 2022, I started noticing a pattern in our conversations. Whenever Clara was not in the room, Victor would bring up Vance Woodworks. He would ask about our distribution networks, our profit margins, and the structure of our corporate trust. He was always trying to probe into the details of my personal finances, testing my sharpness. "Charlie," he said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter while I was washing the dinner dishes, "a company like yours could easily double its revenue if you modernized the management. George Miller is a good craftsman, but he's old school. You need fresh blood in there." I kept my face easy, wiping down a plate. "George runs a tight ship, Victor," I said. "We make good furniture and we pay our workers well." "That's enough for me." Victor let out a short, dismissive laugh. "In business, Charlie, if you're not growing, you're dying. You're sitting on a gold mine and letting it rust." He leaned closer, his eyes scanning my face. "If you ever want to expand or sell your shares, I have a network of venture capitalists who would jump at the chance." I just nodded and kept drying the dishes. I could feel his hunger, a sharp, metallic greed that didn't care about the history or the people in the workshop. During my mornings, I would work in the garden, tending to the rose bushes Martha had loved. Victor would watch me from the study window on the second floor, always with a phone in his hand. He never offered to help, and if I came inside with dirt on my clothes, he would make a small comment about keeping the carpets clean. Clara would look at him and then back at me, her eyes filled with a silent plea for me to let it go. I did let it go, for her sake. I wanted her to have a peaceful household, but the peace was an illusion. One afternoon, I decided to build a walnut desk for Victor's home office, thinking it would be a helpful gesture. I spent 4 days selecting the wood, sanding the boards, and carving the joint interfaces. It was a beautiful piece, showing the deep, rich grain of American walnut. But when I presented it to him, Victor looked at it with a cool, dismissive expression. "It is a bit too traditional, Charlie," he said, running his hand over the satin finish. "Can we paint it white?" "It would match our minimalist aesthetic much better." I felt a sharp pang in my chest. Painting premium walnut is a crime to any woodworker. I told him no, that the wood should be left natural. Victor had shrugged, turned away, and the desk ended up in the garage, covered by a tarp. It was another clear message. My craft, my life's work, meant nothing to him. I filled my days with small, repetitive tasks. I pruned the hedges, cleared the leaves from the gutters, and washed the windows. I wanted to pay my way, even if they were only charging me $600 a month for the whole estate. But Victor would look at me through the study window with a cold, analytical gaze, as if he were calculating the cost of my food against the work I was doing. He was waiting for me to make a mistake, to forget a date or drop a dish, so he could use it as evidence of my decline. I could feel his eyes on me every time I walked down the hall, a constant, silent pressure that made the house feel like a prison. By the summer of 2023, the polite mask began to slip. Victor stopped asking questions and started making demands. He wanted me to introduce him to our major commercial clients. He wanted to sit in on our quarterly planning meetings. When I refused, telling him that George handled those relationships, Victor's face went dark. He did not yell, but his voice took on a sharp, serrated edge. "You're being stubborn, Charlie," he said. "You're holding Clara back. If Vance Woodworks was structured properly, she would have a secure future. Right now, you're just hoarding the assets." I began to realize that Victor did not see me as a father-in-law. He saw me as an obstacle between him and the company Martha and I had built. Then came the first physical evidence of their surveillance. In September of 2023, I went into the second-floor study to look for an old binder of product designs from 1998 that I kept for sentimental reasons. The study was technically Victor's workspace, but the binder lived in the bottom drawer of an oak cabinet I had brought from my old apartment. I kept my files in a specific order, alphabetical, pushed to the back left corner at a precise angle. But that day the binder was out of place. It was sitting 2 inches to the right, the cover facing the wrong direction. Someone had pried open the drawer, gone through the binder, and tried to put it back without knowing my habits. I stood there, my hand on the drawer handle, feeling a cold chill run up my spine. They were searching my room, looking for my personal records, my wills, and the corporate deeds. They wanted to know exactly what I owned and how they could get their hands on it. I locked the cabinet and decided that from that day on, nothing important would be left in this house. I felt the first cold wind of a storm approaching, and I knew I had to build a shelter before the rain started falling. The surveillance did not stop with the study drawer. In October of 2023, Clara started asking me strange, targeted questions during breakfast. We would be sitting at the table, and she would look at me with a look of intense, forced sympathy. "Dad," she said, stirring her coffee, "did you remember to take your blood pressure medication this morning?" I told her I had. "No, I mean sometimes you forget things," she continued, her voice dropping into a soft, patronizing tone. "Like yesterday you left the stove on." I looked at her, my fork halfway to my mouth. "Clara, I did not use the stove yesterday. I made a cold sandwich." She smiled quickly, a nervous, rehearsed gesture. "Oh, maybe it was Victor. But you know, we just worry about your memory. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It happens at your age. We just want to make sure you're safe, Dad." Sometimes people get confused and don't even realize it. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She was trying to create a narrative. She was trying to build a case that I was losing my mental capacity, that my memory was failing, and that I could no longer manage my own affairs. If she could establish a pattern of cognitive decline, she and Victor could try to declare me incompetent and take control of my majority stake in Vance Woodworks. I kept my face blank, but my mind was racing. The kitchen was bright, filled with the smell of Victor's expensive coffee. Clara sat across from me in a silk robe, her phone open next to her plate. She looked at me with those careful, analytical eyes, the same look she used when assessing a marketing campaign. She was looking for cracks, for any sign of weakness she could document. I realized then that she had been coached by Victor. Every question was a script, designed to create a paper trail of my supposed decline. During that breakfast in October, Clara also mentioned a neighbor's father who had been moved to an assisted living facility in Henrico County. She described it as a lovely place, with a garden and 24-hour medical staff, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. Victor had chimed in, saying that it was always best to plan ahead for these transitions before things got too difficult. I had kept my eyes on my toast, chewing slowly. They were not just asking about my memory. They were preparing me for a departure. They wanted me out of the house, locked away in a facility where they could manage my finances through a power of attorney. 2 days later, George Miller called me on a Wednesday morning. His voice was grim, stripped of its usual quiet calm. "Charlie," he said, "I need you to sit down. The commercial lending department at First Coastal Bank just called our main office. They were verifying a loan application that's currently in processing. A $300,000 business expansion loan. The primary applicant is Victor Marsh Design LLC. The guarantor listed on the application is Charles Vance." I stood by the guest room window, my fingers clamping down on the phone. "George," I said, "I haven't signed any loan documents. I haven't agreed to guarantee anything for Victor." "I know," George said. "That's why I'm calling. The signature on the guarantor line looks like yours, Charlie. It's a very good copy. But the bank flagged it because you've never had a personal account with their commercial division. They wanted to verify your identity before releasing the funds." My heart hammered against my ribs. Victor had forged my signature. He had taken my name, my credit, and my company's assets and used them to secure $300, zero for his struggling design firm. Under federal law, this was bank fraud and forgery, both federal felonies. Victor had just committed a crime, and he had used my identity to do it. The betrayal was deep, but what hurt most was the realization that Clara must have helped him. She was the one asking about my memory, trying to lay the groundwork so that if I discovered the loan, they could claim I had signed it and simply forgotten. "Don't tell the bank anything yet, George," I told him. "Tell them you're looking into the corporate records and we'll get back to them in a few days. And George, don't mention this to Clara or Victor." "Understood," George said quietly. "Be careful, Charlie." I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet room. The lines had been drawn. The people I shared a house with were no longer my family. They were my predators, and I had to be ready to defend myself. The tension in the kitchen during those breakfast conversations was almost physical. Clara would sit across from me, her phone constantly buzzing with notifications, her face tight with worry. She would look at me, then at Victor, as if they were sharing a secret I wasn't privy to. I knew she was struggling with the high cost of her lifestyle, and Victor's firm was not bringing in the revenue they had expected. They were desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. When George Miller called me that Wednesday morning, I was standing in the guest room, looking at a small tear in the wallpaper near the window. His voice was a steady anchor in a world that had suddenly started to spin. "Charlie," he said, "First Coastal Bank is requesting a verified signature affidavit. The loan officer, a man named Sarah Miller, said that the signature on the application didn't match the signature card we have on file for our commercial accounts. They want you to come into the branch to sign in person." I felt a quiet chill. Victor had not just made a mistake. He had attempted to bypass the bank's security by using a digital copy of my signature. He had assumed that since I was retired, I wouldn't check the accounts or that George would sign off on it without asking. He was wrong. George Miller had been my partner in everything but name for 30 years, and he protected the company's assets as if they were his own. I told George to delay the bank, telling them I was out of town for a few days. I needed time to gather the records, to consult with Rebecca Finch, and to make sure I had a complete understanding of Victor's plan before I made a move. I was not going to let them know I had discovered the forgery. I had to play the part of the forgetful old man for a little longer, letting them believe their plan was working, while I built the legal cage that would trap them. I knew that one wrong move would alert Victor, and he would cover his tracks. I had to let him think he was succeeding while I built my case. After George's call, I began watching Victor with a new sharp focus. I stayed in my room more, pretending to be tired, but keeping my door cracked so I could hear what was happening in the hallway. In mid-November, I came out of a light afternoon nap and heard a soft rustling sound outside my door. I moved silently to the threshold and peered through the gap. Victor was standing at the hallway table, where I kept a small leather tray with my wallet, keys, and my driver's license. He was holding my license in one hand and his phone in the other, photographing the front and back of the card, adjusting his angle to avoid the glare from the window. I watched him for 3 seconds, my chest tight, before backing away. He was collecting my personal information, likely to forge more financial documents or establish new bank accounts in my name. The next piece of the puzzle came from George Miller a week later. We met at our usual Friday diner, but instead of talking about the workshop, George slid a printout across the table. It was an inventory sheet from our secondary warehouse, which handled our high-end raw timber, the rare walnut, cherry, and white oak boards we used for custom orders. "Charlie, we have a leak," George said. "Over the last 6 weeks, we've had 3 separate stock shortages. Each time, it happens right before the monthly inventory count, and each time, the security cameras in the loading bay mysteriously go down for a 2-day period." "How much is missing?" I asked. $65,000 worth of premium-grade lumber," George said. "It's being moved out by truck, likely sold for cash to local contractors." "Who has access to the camera system during those windows?" George's face was tight. "The new accountant, Brenda Webb. She was hired 6 months ago to handle the secondary warehouse accounts. Victor brought her in, said she was a family contact and highly recommended. I didn't vet her because Victor insisted she was doing us a favor." The diner was crowded, filled with the clatter of silverware and the smell of grease. I stared at the numbers on the sheet. It was a clean, systematic theft. Brenda Webb would disable the security system. Victor's trucks would move the high-value walnut out of the warehouse, and Brenda would write off the loss as damaged goods or administrative discrepancies. They were selling the wood under the table, generating untraceable cash to fund Victor's firm. When I met George Miller at the diner that Friday, the rain was beating against the glass windows, and the diner was filled with the smell of wet coats and coffee. George looked exhausted, his fingers tracing the edges of his mug. "Charlie," he said, "I ran the audit on the secondary warehouse. Brenda Webb has been forging my initials on the dispatch logs. She's been writing off the walnut boards as water damaged and moving them out at night." We have 3 separate logs where the signature is a clear forgery. I took the printouts, my jaw tight. Victor was using the stolen lumber to finance his design projects, reducing his overhead while pocketing the cash. It was a classic embezzlement scheme, using my own materials to build his business. Brenda Webb was a quiet woman in her late 30s who had always kept to herself in the office. I remembered how Victor had introduced her at a Sunday dinner, praising her accounting credentials. I had trusted his recommendation, thinking he was trying to help the company. But Brenda had been brought in specifically to bypass George's controls. She was Victor's inside operative, disabling the security cameras and altering the inventory sheets to cover the theft. The depth of the conspiracy was staggering. They had been stealing from Vance Woodworks for over a year, systematically draining the company's resources. While I sat in the guest room, cooking their dinners and folding their laundry, I felt a cold, hard anger settle in my chest. They thought I was a foolish old man, but they were about to learn that a carpenter knows how to disassemble a structure just as well as he knows how to build one. I told George to keep quiet, and that we would gather more files before moving. We needed the private forensic accountant's report to be absolute, leaving Victor and Brenda with no room to escape. Every invoice, every dispatch log, every single transaction would be laid bare. The diner where I met George was a quiet place on the edge of town, frequented by truck drivers and local construction workers. The rain was drumming on the metal roof, creating a steady, rhythmic noise that matched the serious mood at our table. George had spread the inventory logs out next to his coffee cup, his finger pointing to a series of entries from the secondary warehouse. "Look at this, Charlie," he said, his voice low. "Brenda Webb has been writing off these walnut boards as unusable due to moisture damage." But I checked the warehouse records. That bay has a dehumidifier that has been running constantly since 2018. There is no moisture damage. The wood was loaded onto a truck registered to Marsh Design LLC on November 12th. I have the gate logs here. Brenda Webb signed the release, and she used my initials to authorize the gate pass. I looked at the forged initials on the paper. It was a crude copy, lacking the distinctive loop George always used. Victor had been using my own materials to build his clients' custom furniture, charging them premium rates while paying Vance Woodworks nothing. It was a double theft. He was stealing the raw lumber from the company, and he was forging my name to secure loans from the bank. Brenda Webb was his inside operative, hired specifically to cover the track. Brenda was a quiet, unassuming accountant who had been recommended by Victor's Design Association. She had seemed professional when we hired her, but now I saw the pattern. Victor had placed her in the secondary warehouse specifically because it was less supervised than our main Richmond facility. They had been moving high-value white oak and cherry wood for months, selling it under the table for cash or using it to reduce the overhead of Marsh Design projects. The total value of the stolen lumber was closer to $85,000 when I factored in the shipping and handling costs. I felt a cold, hard resolve. I told George to make copies of all the gate logs and keep them in his safe. We were going to let Victor continue his operation for a few more weeks. I wanted the forensic accountant to have a complete, undeniable record of every board they had stolen. Victor thought he was building a business, but he was actually building his own prison sentence. By the beginning of December, my preparations were complete. I had quietly rented a small, one-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city, paying the deposit and the first month's rent of $100 in cash. I had not told Clara or Victor, only George Miller knew the address. Over the course of 3 weeks, I systematically moved my most important personal documents out of the River Roadhouse. I took the deeds to the company properties, the stock certificates for Vance Woodworks, and Martha's old personal journals, placing them in a safety deposit box at a small bank branch downtown that Victor had no connection to. I also made copies of the inventory files and bank logs, but in each copy I made a small, deliberate error, transposing 2 digits in the serial numbers or changing a date by a single day. If Victor or Brenda tried to use these documents to justify their transactions, those errors would tell me exactly which file they had stolen. I packed my leather suitcase, hid it in the back of my closet under some old winter coats, and waited. I chose Christmas night as my departure date because I knew Victor's associates would be there, and the public confrontation would give me the perfect justification to leave without raising suspicion. The new apartment was on the fourth floor of an old brick building. It had no view to speak of, just the brick wall of the warehouse next door. But the heating was excellent, and the rent was fair. I spent my evenings there cleaning the space, setting up a single table and chair, and listening to the hum of the traffic below. It was a lonely space, but it was mine. It was a space where Victor's cameras and Clara's questions could not reach me. My visit to the safety deposit box at Richmond Federal Savings was a quiet, solemn affair. The vault manager, a polite woman named Susan, led me down to the basement, where the air was cool and smelled of old paper and steel. I unlocked box 482, sliding my original corporate deeds, the stock certificates, and Martha's ledgers inside. I also packed Martha's silver sewing thimble, the last personal item I had retrieved from the River Roadhouse. It was a small, dented piece of metal, but it represented a lifetime of quiet partnership. I locked the box, handed Susan the key, and walked out into the cold winter air, feeling a sense of relief. The assets were safe. Victor could not touch them. And now, Christmas dinner had come and gone. The $200 rental agreement was still sitting on the mahogany table downstairs, unsigned. I picked up my suitcase, walked out of my room, and moved down the hallway. I did not make a sound, slipped out the side door into the cold, damp December air. The wind was biting, and the gravel crunched softly under my boots. I walked down the long driveway, past Victor's locked SUV, and made my way to the service road. George Miller's truck was parked half a block away, its headlights off. George was standing by the door, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, steam rising from his breath. When he saw me, he took the suitcase from my hand and tossed it into the truck bed. "You okay, Charlie?" he asked, climbing into the driver's seat. "Better than I've been in a long time, George," I said, buckling my seatbelt. "Let's go home." We drove through the quiet, holiday-lit streets of Richmond in silence. The city was asleep, the Christmas lights blinking on the empty storefronts. When we arrived at my new apartment, George helped me carry my bag up the stairs. He had already set up a coffee maker in the small kitchen, and 2 mugs were waiting on the counter. We sat at the small table, drinking the hot black coffee, and I felt the weight of the last 3 years begin to lift from my shoulders. The first stage was over. Tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. I had the files, I had George, and I had Rebecca Finch ready to move. Victor and Clara had no idea what was coming. I laid down on the narrow bed, closed my eyes, and slept soundly for the first time in months. The quiet apartment was my fortress, and I was finally ready to fight back. My new apartment on the west side of Richmond was a quiet, modest space. It was located on the 4th floor of an old brick building that had once been a textile mill. The walls were exposed brick, the floors were worn pine, and the single window looked out onto a quiet street lined with maples. It was a simple place, containing only a single bed, a wooden chair, and my chest of tools. But when I unlocked the door that night, it felt like the safest place in the world. There were no cameras here, no hushed whispers in the hallway, no calculated questions about my memory from a daughter who had chosen greed over family. The safety deposit box visit had been a necessary precaution. I had spent 2 hours at Richmond Federal Savings meticulously organizing the deeds, the stock certificates, and Martha's journals in box 482. Susan, the vault manager, had been very polite, letting me take all the time I needed in the private viewing room. As I placed Martha's old handwritten cookbooks and ledger notebooks inside the metal box, I felt a quiet connection to her. She had been the mind of the company, and she had built the safeguards that would now protect us. I locked the box, put the key in my pocket, and felt a sense of security. On Christmas night, as I sat at the table with Victor's partners, I had watched Clara and Victor laughing and celebrating. They had looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt, believing they had finally forced the old man to pay rent. They had no idea that my suitcase was already packed, sitting in the back of my closet, and that George Miller was waiting down the road in his truck. When I walked out of that house, I left the $2,200 rental agreement on the table. Unsigned. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out into the cold winter rain, carrying my suitcase, and climbed into George's truck. The drive to the new apartment was silent, the wipers sweeping away the freezing rain. When we arrived, George helped me carry my bag up the stairs, and we sat in the small kitchen drinking the hot coffee he had made. I was tired, my bones ached, but for the first time in 3 years I was free. The first stage of our counterattack was complete, and tomorrow the legal storm would begin on the morning of December 26th at 8 a.m. George Miller and I walked into the law offices of Rebecca Finch. Her office was located on the 14th floor of a high-rise downtown, and when we arrived, she already had 3 thick folders laid out on her desk. Rebecca was 53 years old, a sharp, precise attorney who had been representing Vance Woodworks for 9 years. She had been a close friend of Martha's, and she was not a person who wasted time on pleasantries when there was work to be done. The office smelled of old books and fresh coffee, a familiar, comforting combination that made me feel grounded. "Sit down, Charles," she said, gesturing to the leather chairs. "We have a lot to cover." She opened the first folder, which contained the details of the supplemental credit card I had given to Clara. "This is a personal account," Rebecca said. "Under federal consumer credit laws, specifically the Truth in Lending Act, the primary cardholder has absolute authority over all supplemental accounts. You do not need to give notice, and you do not need to justify your decision. You can cancel Clara's card with a single phone call, and she has no legal recourse. The law is entirely on your side here, Charles. It is your account, your liability, and you can withdraw authorization instantly." "Do it today," I said. Rebecca nodded and made a note. She moved to the second folder, which contained the registration for the corporate SUV Victor had been driving. "The vehicle is registered to Vance Woodworks," she said. "Victor was granted a temporary use authorization in March of 2022. I want to emphasize the word temporary because it appears in the contract 4 times. This authorization can be revoked at any time without prior notice. We will send a formal retrieval notice to his office today, giving him 48 hours to surrender the vehicle. If he does not comply, we will send a tow team to recover it. Under corporate law, Victor has no claim of ownership. The vehicle is an asset of Vance Woodworks, and the corporation is withdrawing its permission." I nodded. "Send the notice." Rebecca then picked up the third folder, which was much thicker than the others. "This is the lease agreement for the River Road property," she said. "Clara signed it in 2018, and I have identified 5 separate material breaches of the contract terms. First, they sublet the property for commercial filming without corporate consent. Second, they made structural changes to the home office without approval. Third, Victor used the property address as collateral on a personal loan application. Fourth, they hosted commercial design events on the property on 3 documented occasions. And fifth, they have failed to pay the $600 family accommodation fee for 11 of the past 14 months. Under New York landlord-tenant law, these violations constitute a material breach of the lease. When I calculate the remediation costs, outstanding fees, and contract penalties, the total liability comes to $34,200. Sitting in Rebecca Finch's office, the hum of the city traffic below was a distant murmur. The walls of the room were lined with mahogany bookshelves filled with legal reporters and corporate statutes. Rebecca sat behind her large desk, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looking at me with a serious, focused expression. "Charles," she said, leaning forward, "we need to be very clear about the legal boundaries here. Under federal consumer protection laws, specifically the Truth in Lending Act, Clara's card is a supplemental line of credit. Since you are the primary account holder, you have the absolute legal right to terminate her access at any time. The bank does not require a reason, and Clara has no legal standing to challenge it. She is simply an authorized user, and that authorization can be withdrawn with a single phone call. I have the bank's corporate line ready. If you agree, we can cancel the card now." I nodded. "Cancel it." Rebecca picked up the receiver and completed the transaction in less than 5 minutes. She then opened the second folder, which contained the use authorization for the company SUV. "Under corporate law, the vehicle is registered to Vance Woodworks, Inc., she explained. Victor was granted a temporary use authorization, which is a non-exclusive license. This license can be revoked at the discretion of the majority shareholder or the board. Since you hold 71% of the shares, you have the authority to revoke it immediately. We will send a certified retrieval notice to Victor's office today. He will have 48 hours to return the keys, or we will have the vehicle recovered by a licensed recovery team. The law is clear. The vehicle is corporate property, and Victor has no legal claim to it. Rebecca then turned to the thick folder on the River Road residence. This is where Victor and Clara are most vulnerable, she said, her voice taking on a sharp, professional edge. The lease Clara signed in 2018 is a corporate accommodation agreement. It has strict clauses regarding tenant behavior and property use. I have documented 5 distinct material breaches. They sublet the property for commercial filming, reconfigured the study without corporate approval, used the address as collateral, hosted commercial design events, and failed to pay the $600 accommodation fee for 11 of the past 14 months. Under New York landlord-tenant law, specifically the sections governing lease violations and eviction, these breaches constitute a material default. The total liability, including unpaid fees and remediation costs, is $34,200. We will serve them with a formal 10-day notice to cure or quit under RPayPel Section 753. If they do not pay the full amount and vacate the property within the designated period, we will file a formal eviction petition in Richmond County Court. I looked at Rebecca, feeling a cold, unyielding resolve. Let's proceed with the eviction process. The law is our tool, and we will use it with precision. I will not have my company's assets used to fund Victor's firm or Clara's vanity. We will reclaim the River Road house and restore the corporate boundaries. On the afternoon of December 26th, Clara went shopping at the Harrington Collection, an upscale retail mall where the bags cost more than the average monthly grocery bill. I knew this because Clara was live streaming the experience to her social media followers. George Miller had sent me the link, and I sat at my kitchen table, watching the stream on my laptop. Clara was in fine form. She was wearing a new wool coat, her hair was freshly styled, and she was holding a deep burgundy evening gown up to her shoulders, turning to face the camera. "New Year's needs a new dress, right?" she said to the lens, laughing. "This one is calling my name, guys." She walked to the register and handed her credit card to the cashier with the casual confidence of someone who had never had a transaction declined in her life. The cashier ran the card. A red light flashed on the terminal. The cashier ran it again, frowning. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the cashier said, her voice carrying clearly through the live stream. "It's not going through." Clara's smile stayed in place, but I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "Try it again," she said. "It must be a system error." The cashier tried a third time, but the terminal beeped loudly. "It's declined, ma'am." Clara stepped to the side, still holding her phone. The camera was angled down at the marble floor now, but the microphone was still active, catching every word. She called the credit card company, her voice dropping into a tight, strained register. "I need to know why my card ending in 4829 was just declined," she told the operator. I heard the faint sound of keys clicking on the other end. "I see here that the supplemental card on this account was canceled this morning, at the request of the primary holder, Mr. Charles Vance," the operator said. The cancellation took effect at 11:47 a.m. The live stream ended abruptly 11 seconds later. Clara had just been publicly humiliated in front of 1,214 live viewers, finding out on camera that her father had cut off her cash flow. Under the Truth in Lending Act, my cancellation was immediate and absolute. Clara had spent years using my card to fund her luxury lifestyle, boasting to her friends about her wealthy family, but with a single phone call, I had pulled the plug on her performance. She had no legal ground to stand on. She was simply an authorized user whose authorization had been revoked. I sat at my laptop, staring at the blank screen where Clara's face had been. I did not feel a sense of triumph. I only felt a quiet, heavy sadness. This was the girl who used to play in the sawdust at my feet, who had sand on her shoes and laughed when I gave her a wooden toy. Now, she was a woman who defined her worth by the balance of a credit card she did not own, willing to see nuke her father in front of 23 dinner guests just to maintain a facade of wealth. I closed the laptop, stood up, and went to the window. The rain had started again, washing the Richmond streets, and I knew that the first domino had fallen. Clara would call. She would be angry, but she would finally have to face the reality that my generosity was not a bottomless well. The video of Clara's live stream was painful to watch, but it was necessary evidence. She stood in the middle of the luxury boutique at the Harrington Collection, surrounded by racks of designer clothes and marble columns. She was holding a deep burgundy silk gown, laughing and talking to her social media followers. The gown was priced at $2,400. Clara had walked to the register with the ease of someone who had never had a transaction declined in her life, handing her credit card to the cashier with a practiced, elegant gesture. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the cashier had said after running the card twice. "The terminal is showing a decline." Clara's smile had frozen, her eyes wide with shock. "Try it again," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It must be a system error." The cashier tried a third time, but the terminal beeped loudly. "It's declined, ma'am. Do you have another form of payment?" Clara's face went white. She stepped to the side, still holding her phone, the camera pointing at the marble floor while she called the bank. The bank representative's voice carried clearly through the microphone. "I see here that the supplemental card ending in 4829 was canceled this morning at the request of the primary holder, Mr. Charles Vance," the operator said. The cancellation took effect at 11:47 a.m. Clara had ended the stream immediately, but the damage was already done. 1,214 people had watched her find out her father had cut off her cash flow on live video. I shut my laptop, the quiet of my new apartment settling around me. I felt no joy in her humiliation, only a quiet, heavy sadness. This was the girl who had sand on her shoes and laughed when I gave her a wooden toy. Now she was a woman who defined her worth by the balance of a credit card she did not own. She had tried to see-nuke her father in front of 23 guests, but she had ended up publicly see-nuke herself. Clara had spent years using my card to fund her luxury lifestyle, boasting to her friends about her wealthy family, but with a single phone call, I had pulled the plug on her performance. She had no legal ground to challenge it. Under the Truth in Lending Act, my cancellation was immediate and absolute. The first domino had fallen, and I knew she would call soon, furious and desperate. But I was ready. I was no longer the father who stayed silent. I was the majority shareholder reclaiming his legacy. A few minutes after the live stream ended, Rebecca Finch emailed me the detailed expense statements for Clara's supplemental card for the last 12 months. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking a cup of coffee that was going cold, and read through the transactions line by line. The total spent in a single year was $96,412. It was a staggering amount of money, spent on things that had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with status. There were charges for a spa weekend in Connecticut, Michelin-starred restaurants in New York, and 6 separate transactions from a single boutique in March, alone totaling $14,800. But what made my jaw tight were the social media captions Clara had posted alongside these purchases, which I pulled up on my phone. She had posted a photo of a green designer handbag with the caption, "Victor spoils me rotten. Honestly, don't deserve him." She had posted a photo of a resort weekend with the caption, "Husband of the Year. I married the right man." She had even posted a photo of custom dining chairs, which I had paid for out of the company account, with the caption, "Finally upgraded our dining room. Victor has such incredible taste." I sat with that for a long time. For 3 years, I had been paying for a story carefully curated by Clara and Victor to show the world that she had a successful, wealthy husband who provided a luxurious life for her. In this story, I was just a background detail, the retired father who needed a place to stay, the dead-weight old man. Clara was funding her husband's reputation and her own social status with my money, while Victor embezzled my lumber and forged my name on loans. I had not been supporting my daughter, I had been financing a lie. I closed the laptop, feeling a cold resolve. The story was over. I printed out the statements and highlighted the most egregious charges, placing them in my Manila folder. I wanted to have every transaction documented, every dollar accounted for. If Clara tried to claim that the card was a gift or that I had agreed to these expenses, I had the corporate records showing that these accounts were registered under corporate overhead for Vance Woodworks, meant for business travel and client hosting. By using the card for personal luxury, Clara had technically committed a dissipation of corporate assets, a violation that Rebecca Finch could use in court if necessary. I was not going to let them twist the facts. The paper trail was clear, and it led directly to their greed. I felt a quiet strength returning. a sense of order that I had not felt since Martha passed. I was no longer a victim of their manipulation. I was the architect of their accountability. Sitting in the quiet of my apartment, I found myself looking at a photo of Martha on the sideboard. She was smiling, her eyes bright behind her wire-rimmed glasses, holding a small cedar box we had carved together on our 10th anniversary. I closed my eyes and spoke to her in the quiet room. "I'm sorry, Martha," I whispered. "I tried to give her the world, but I ended up giving her a license to steal. I wanted her to have everything we never had, but it corrupted her." I felt a heavy ache in my chest, a mixture of grief and failure, but I also felt a deep, unyielding resolve. I had to clean up this mess. I had to protect the company we had built, not just for my sake, but for the workers who had stood by us for decades. I had to teach Clara that there are boundaries and that a life built on lies will eventually fall apart. I opened my eyes, looked back at the spreadsheet, and felt my determination harden. Tomorrow, I would meet with the bank's legal team to present our findings on Victor's forgery. Clara's dinner parties were another source of immense expense. She would hire local caterers who charged $150 a head, serving imported truffle butter and Wagyu beef sliders to their wealthy social climbing friends. I remember sitting at the edge of the dining room during one of those events in 2022, holding a glass of plain water, while Clara's friends laughed and talked about their trips to Aspen. Victor had introduced me as Clara's retired father who helps out around the house, and when one of the guests asked if I had designed the walnut sideboard, Victor had quickly cut in, saying it was a vintage piece they had sourced from a local estate sale. Clara had nodded along, not saying a word to correct him. I had walked back to my room, feeling the heavy silence of the house, and realized that my years of labor were just a secret they wanted to hide. They wanted my money, but they were nuke by my trade. The apartment was cold, and I went to the thermostat, turning the heat up to 72. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, washing the grime from the brick buildings across the street. I thought about the River Roadhouse, the high ceiling, the mahogany table, and the expensive wine Victor liked to drink. They were probably sitting in that room right now, arguing, trying to figure out how Clara's card had been shut down. They had no idea that the credit card was only the first step. They had no idea that I had spent the last 3 weeks moving every important file, every scrap of history, out of their reach. I was no longer the old man they could ignore. I was the founder of Vance Woodworks, and I was taking my company back. I would not allow them to spend another dollar of corporate money to build a facade of wealth. The files in my safety deposit box were the lock, and Rebecca Finch was the key. We were going to shut down the performance once and for all, and Clara would have to learn what it means to work for a living, just as Martha and I had done for 40 years. On the morning of December 27th, Victor Marsh had a meeting with the procurement director of the Meridian Group at their offices on Commerce Street. This was the largest potential contract Victor's design firm had ever pursued, a deal worth $180, and that he hoped would save his struggling business. He arrived at 8:52 a.m., driving the black company SUV. He parked directly in front of the building, right under the main entrance sign, and stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his jacket with the confidence of a man who was about to close a massive deal. The procurement director came down to meet him in the lobby, and they were shaking hands on the front steps when Philip, our logistics supervisor at Vance Woodworks, walked up. Philip was a steady, quiet man who had worked for me for 11 years, and he was carrying a folder of legal documents. "Excuse me, Mr. Marsh," Philip said, his voice loud enough to carry to the director. "I am here to retrieve the company vehicle." Victor's face went white. "What are you talking about?" he hissed. "This is my vehicle. Get out of here before I call the police." Philip calmly opened the folder and produced the use authorization contract Victor had signed in March of 2022. "The registration is under Vance Woodworks, Mr. Marsh," Philip said, pointing to the registration page. "The temporary use authorization has been officially revoked by the majority shareholder, Charles Vance, effective 9 a.m. today. You have 48 hours to surrender the keys, but since I am here, I will take them now. If you refuse, we have a tow team waiting around the corner." The procurement director stood on the steps, his arms crossed, watching the entire exchange. Victor tried to argue, telling Philip the paperwork was fraudulent, but Philip stood his ground, showing Victor his signatures on pages 1, 3, and the final page. Victor got louder, asking Philip if he had any idea who he was, but Philip simply repeated that the authorization was revoked. Finally, realizing he had no choice and that his client was watching, Victor threw the keys at Philip's chest, grabbed his briefcase, and walked inside. The meeting, however, did not go well. The Meridian Group called our main office 2 hours later to confirm the vehicle registration, and within an hour, they canceled the appointment permanently. Victor had lost his contract and his car in front of his most important client. I received a text from Philip at 10:15 a.m. confirming the retrieval. The SUV was already in our company lot, and the keys were on George Miller's desk. I sat in my quiet apartment looking at the rain on the window and pictured Victor standing in that lobby, realizing his big deal was gone. He had built his reputation on the appearance of success, driving my company's car and living in my company's house. But without those props, he was just a struggling designer with a forged loan application and a mount of debt. The facade was crumbling, and Victor was finally finding out what happens when you build a house on someone else's foundation. Victor's meeting with the procurement director of the Meridian Group was set for 9:00 a.m. on Commerce Street. This was the largest potential contract Victor's design firm had ever pursued, a deal worth $180. That was zero that he hoped would save his struggling business. He arrived at 8:52 a.m., driving the black company SUV. He parked directly in front of the building, right under the main entrance sign, and stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his jacket with the confidence of a man who was about to close a massive deal. The procurement director came down to meet him in the lobby, and they were shaking hands on the front steps when Philip, our logistics supervisor at Vance Woodworks, walked up. Philip was a steady, quiet man who had worked for me for 11 years, and he was carrying a folder of legal documents. "Excuse me, Mr. Marsh," Philip said, his voice loud enough to carry to the director. "I am here to retrieve the company vehicle." Victor's face went white. "What are you talking about?" he hissed. "This is my vehicle. Get out of here before I call the police." Philip calmly opened the folder and produced the use authorization contract Victor had signed in March of 2022. "The registration is under Vance Woodworks, Mr. Marsh," Philip said, pointing to the registration page. "The temporary use authorization has been officially revoked by the majority shareholder, Charles Vance, effective 9:00 a.m. today. You have 48 hours to surrender the keys, but since I am here, I will take them now. If you refuse, we have a tow team waiting around the corner." The procurement director stood on the steps, his arms crossed, watching the entire exchange. Victor tried to argue, telling Philip the paperwork was fraudulent, but Philip stood his ground, showing Victor his signatures on pages 1, 3, and the final page. Victor got louder, asking Philip if he had any idea who he was, but Philip simply repeated that the authorization was revoked. Finally, realizing he had no choice and that his client was watching, Victor threw the keys at Philip's chest, grabbed his briefcase, and walked inside. The meeting, however, did not go well. The Meridian Group called our main office 2 hours later to confirm the vehicle registration, and within an hour, they canceled the appointment permanently. Victor had lost his contract and his car in front of his most important client. I received a text from Philip at 10:15 a.m. confirming the retrieval. The SUV was already in our company lot, and the keys were on George Miller's desk. I sat in my quiet apartment looking at the rain on the window and pictured Victor standing in that lobby, realizing his big deal was gone. He had built his reputation on the appearance of success, driving my company's car and living in my company's house. But without those props, he was just a struggling designer with a forged loan application and a mount of debt. The facade was crumbling, and Victor was finally finding out what happens when you build a house on someone else's foundation. Clara called Rebecca Finch's office at 2 p.m. that afternoon, her voice filled with a furious, trembling energy. I sat in Rebecca's office, listening to the call on speakerphone. "I want to know what is going on," Clara demanded. "My credit card was declined yesterday, Victor's car was towed this morning, and now I have an email about lease violations and a $34,200 fee. We have lived in this house for 3 years without a single complaint. That is not accurate. Mrs. Marsh, Rebecca said calmly, her voice even and professional. We have been documenting these violations for some time. The lease agreement you signed in 2018 specifies residential use only. You sublet the property for commercial filming, reconfigured the home office without corporate approval, used the address as collateral on a loan, hosted commercial design events, and failed to pay the $600 monthly fee for 11 of the past 14 months. These constitute a material breach of the lease terms under New York State landlord-tenant law. It's my father's house, Clara yelled. He doesn't care about these details. He's retired. He doesn't even know what you're doing. This is between me and him. Actually, Mrs. Marsh, Rebecca said, the property is owned by Vance Woodworks, and your father is the majority shareholder. He approved these actions. The $34,200 is the total outstanding debt and remediation cost. You have 30 days to pay the full amount and vacate the property, or we will initiate formal eviction proceedings in county court. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear Clara's heavy breathing. Dad, she whispered, realizing I was in the room. Are you there? Why are you doing this to me? I did not answer. I let the silence hang, heavy and cold. Rebecca waited for a moment, then spoke. You have the terms, Mrs. Marsh. I suggest you contact a lawyer. She hung up the phone and looked at me. She knows now, Charles, Rebecca said. They both do. The battle had officially begun. Rebecca Finch sat back in her chair, capping her pen. She was a woman who had seen many family disputes in her career, but she looked at me with a rare, quiet respect. You did the right thing, Charles, she said. If you had confronted Clara directly, Victor would have controlled the narrative. By letting the corporate legal system handle it, you've taken away their ability to manipulate you. The law is impersonal, and that's exactly what you need right now. I nodded, my throat tight. I did not want to hurt my daughter, but I had to protect the legacy Martha and I had built. Clara had made her choice when she signed that rental agreement on my own company's letterhead. She had chosen Victor's greed over my love, and now she had to face the legal consequences of that choice. Clara called Rebecca Finch's office at 2 p.m. that afternoon, her voice filled with a furious, trembling energy. I sat in Rebecca's office, listening to the call on speakerphone. I want to know what is going on, Clara demanded. My credit card was declined yesterday, Victor's car was towed this morning, and now I have an email about lease violations and a $34,200 fee. We have lived in this house for 3 years without a single complaint. That is not accurate, Mrs. Marsh, Rebecca said calmly, her voice even and professional. We have been documenting these violations for some time. The lease agreement you signed in 2018 specifies residential use only. You sublet the property for commercial filming, reconfigured the home office without corporate approval, used the address as collateral on a loan, hosted commercial design events, and failed to pay the $600 monthly fee for 11 of the past 14 months. These constitute a material breach of the lease terms under New York State landlord-tenant law. It's my father's house, Clara yelled. He doesn't care about these details. He's retired. He doesn't even know what you're doing. This is between me and him. Actually, Mrs. Marsh, Rebecca said, the property is owned by Vance Woodworks, and your father is the majority shareholder. He approved these actions. The $34,200 is the total outstanding debt and remediation cost. You have 30 days to pay the full amount and vacate the property, or we will initiate formal eviction proceedings in county court. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear Clara's heavy breathing. Dad? She whispered, realizing I was in the room. Are you there? Why are you doing this to me? I did not answer. I let the silence hang, heavy and cold. Rebecca waited for a moment, then spoke. You have the terms, Mrs. Marsh. I suggest you contact a lawyer. She hung up the phone and looked at me. She knows now, Charles, Rebecca said. They both do. The battle had officially begun. Rebecca Finch sat back in her chair, capping her pen. She was a woman who had seen many family disputes in her career, but she looked at me with a rare, quiet respect. You did the right thing, Charles, she said. If you had confronted Clara directly, Victor would have controlled the narrative. By letting the corporate legal system handle it, you've taken away their ability to manipulate you. The law is impersonal, and that's exactly what you need right now. I nodded, my throat tight. I did not want to hurt my daughter, but I had to protect the legacy Martha and I had built. Clara had made her choice when she signed that rental agreement on my own company's letterhead. She had chosen Victor's greed over my love, and now she had to face the legal consequences of that choice. She had to learn that actions have consequences, even when you are the founder's daughter. 2 weeks later, Victor and Clara made their move. They called me and asked to meet at a local diner, claiming they wanted to clear things up and simplify my affairs. When they arrived, Victor set a thick leather portfolio on the table, opening it with the easy confidence of a man who believed the hard part was already over. "It's just some basic healthcare and financial management documents, Charlie," Victor said. "They are designed to make things simpler for everyone, especially for you as you get older." The top sheet was a standard healthcare directive, but as I turned the pages, my eyes caught a clause on page 4, buried between a medical release and a property management transfer. It was a clause granting Victor Marsh sole discretionary authority over the business assets of Vance Woodworks in the event that Charles Vance was deemed unable to manage them independently. They were trying to get me to sign away my company. I let my hands tremble slightly, looking confused. "This is a lot of reading," I said, my voice soft. "Take all the time you need," Victor said, leaning back with a smug look. Clara covered my hand with hers. "We'll explain anything that's confusing, Dad. Just ask." My throat burned. I looked at Clara, my daughter, whose hand had been held by mine when she was 4 hours old, and I realized how far she had fallen. "Could you get me a glass of water, Clara?" I asked. "My throat is dry." "Of course," she said, standing up and heading to the counter. The moment she turned her back, I turned to the very last page of the document. In the blank margin at the bottom, in my clearest handwriting, I wrote 7 words. This document was not signed. C. Vance. I turned back to the front page as Clara returned with the water. "Thank you," I said. "I think I need a few days to review these." Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course, Charlie. No rush." But I knew that when he opened the folder that night, he would realize I was not as forgetful as he thought. They left the diner, Victor walking slightly ahead of Clara, his shoulders stiff with tension. I sat at the table for a few minutes watching them through the window. They were desperate. The credit card cancellation and the vehicle retrieval had hit them hard, and the demand for $34,200 had put them on a short timeline. They needed control of Vance Woodworks to clear Victor's debts and secure their position, and they had hoped I would sign this document without reading the fine print. I picked up the portfolio and put it in my bag. I had not signed the document, but I had written the 7 words that would prove I was fully aware of their attempt to manipulate me. Under federal and state laws governing elder financial abuse, specifically California Welfare and Institutions Code Section 15610.3030 or similar state statutes, trying to obtain control of an elder's assets through deception or undue influence is a serious offense. By writing those words, I had created a piece of evidence that Rebecca Finch could use to show Victor's intent. I walked out of the diner, the winter air cold on my face, and felt a quiet satisfaction. The trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. 2 weeks later, Victor and Clara made their move. They called me and asked to meet at a local diner, claiming they wanted to clear things up and simplify my affairs. When they arrived, Victor set a thick leather portfolio on the table, opening it with the easy confidence of a man who believed the hard part was already over. "It's just some basic healthcare and financial management documents, Charlie," Victor said. "They are designed to make things simpler for everyone, especially for you as you get older." The top sheet was a standard healthcare directive. But as I turned the pages, my eyes caught a clause on page 4, buried between a medical release and a property management transfer. It was a clause granting Victor Marsh sole discretionary authority over the business assets of Vance Woodworks in the event that Charles Vance was deemed unable to manage them independently. They were trying to get me to sign away my company. I let my hands tremble slightly, looking confused. "This is a lot of reading," I said, my voice soft. "Take all the time you need," Victor said, leaning back with a smug look. Clara covered my hand with hers. "We'll explain anything that's confusing, Dad. Just ask." My throat burned. I looked at Clara, my daughter, whose hand had been held by mine when she was 4 hours old, and I realized how far she had fallen. "Could you get me a glass of water, Clara?" I asked. "My throat is dry." Of course, she said, standing up and heading to the counter. The moment she turned her back, I turned to the very last page of the document. In the blank margin at the bottom, in my clearest handwriting, I wrote 7 words. This document was not signed. C. Vance. I turned back to the front page as Clara returned with the water. Thank you, I said. I think I need a few days to review these. Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Of course, Charlie. No rush. But I knew that when he opened the folder that night, he would realize I was not as forgetful as he thought. They left the diner, Victor walking slightly ahead of Clara, his shoulders stiff with tension. I sat at the table for a few minutes, watching them through the window. They were desperate. The credit card cancellation and the vehicle retrieval had hit them hard, and the demand for $34,200 had put them on a short timeline. They needed control of Vance Woodworks to clear Victor's debts and secure their position, and they had hoped I would sign this document without reading the fine print. I picked up the portfolio and put it in my bag. I had not signed the document, but I had written the 7 words that would prove I was fully aware of their attempt to manipulate me. Under federal and state laws governing elder financial abuse, specifically California Welfare and Institutions, Code Section 1561030, or similar state statutes, trying to obtain control of an elder's assets through deception or undue influence is a serious offense. By writing those words, I had created a piece of evidence that Rebecca Finch could use to show Victor's intent. I walked out of the diner, the winter air cold on my face, and felt a quiet satisfaction. The trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. They thought they were outsmarting an old man, but they had only documented their own bad faith. My phone rang at 2:14 a.m. a week later. It was Clara, her voice stripped of all its warmth and social register. "Dad," she said, "can you meet me now?" "Come to my apartment," I said. "The door is unlocked." She arrived 20 minutes later, wearing an old sweatshirt and jeans, her face bare of makeup. She looked exhausted down to the bone. She stood in my living room, looking around the small space before sitting at the kitchen table. She slid her phone toward me, the screen open to a Photos app. "Screenshots, dozens of them. I found these on Victor's laptop," she whispered, her voice tight. "He left it open. I don't think he meant to." I picked up the phone and scrolled. The first screenshot was a transfer agreement for the sale of all operating assets of Victor Marsh Design LLC to Vance Woodworks. Victor was planning to sell his failing business to my company for a massive payout. The second screenshot was an offshore bank account in his name alone. The third was a Delaware shell company, registered under Clara's name, which would assume $480,000 in existing debt. Victor was planning to transfer the assets of Vance Woodworks offshore, leaving Clara with a bankrupt shell company and $480,000 in debt. Clara looked at me, her eyes red. "I need you to tell me it's not true," she said, her voice cracking. "That he didn't marry me just because of the company." I looked at my daughter, feeling a mixture of pity and sorrow. "I don't know if he ever loved you, Clara," I said, "but I know he used you." She pressed her lips together, fighting back tears. Then her face hardened, and that familiar calculating look returned to her eyes. "I can get you everything," she said. "His financial records, the offshore accounts, the texts. I can give you enough to put him away, but I need something in return. Leave me the River Roadhouse and give me a 10% stake in Vance Woodworks." I looked at her, realizing she was not here out of regret. She was here because her husband was about to betray her, and she wanted to secure her spot on the winning side. "Let me think about it," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and left, not realizing I had not said yes. I sat in the quiet apartment after she left, the screenshots still on my phone. Clara had spent 6 years married to a man who saw her as a financial asset, and her first instinct upon discovering his betrayal was to negotiate a deal with me. She was still trying to trade information for property, still trying to secure her luxury lifestyle at my expense. She had not apologized for the Christmas dinner, or for the forged signature, or for the attempt to declare me incompetent. She had only offered to sell out her husband to save herself. I felt a cold, deep sadness. The daughter I had raised was gone, replaced by a negotiator who used her father's love as a bargaining chip. I forwarded the screenshots to Rebecca Finch, and I knew that this was the final piece we needed. Victor Marsh was going to prison, and Clara was going to find out that she could not negotiate her way out of her choices. My phone rang at 2, 14 a.m. a week later. It was Clara, her voice stripped of all its warmth and social register. "Dad," she said, "can you meet me now?" "Come to my apartment," I said. "The door is unlocked." She arrived 20 minutes later, wearing an old sweatshirt and jeans, her face bare of makeup. She looked exhausted down to the bone. She stood in my living room, looking around the small space before sitting at the kitchen table. She slid her phone toward me. The screen opened to a Photos app. Screenshots, dozens of them. "I found these on Victor's laptop," she whispered, her voice tight. "He left it open. I don't think he meant to." I picked up the phone and scrolled. The first screenshot was a transfer agreement for the sale of all operating assets of Victor Marsh Design LLC to Vance Woodworks. Victor was planning to sell his failing business to my company for a massive payout. The second screenshot was an offshore bank account in his name alone. The third was a Delaware shell company registered under Clara's name, which would assume $480,000 in existing debt. Victor was planning to transfer the assets of Vance Woodworks offshore, leaving Clara with a bankrupt shell company and $480,000 in debt. Clara looked at me, her eyes red. "I need you to tell me it's not true," she said, her voice cracking, "that he didn't marry me just because of the company." I looked at my daughter, feeling a mixture of pity and sorrow. "I don't know if he ever loved you, Clara," I said. "But I know he used you." She pressed her lips together, fighting back tears. Then her face hardened, and that familiar calculating look returned to her eyes. "I can get you everything," she said. "His financial records, the offshore accounts, the texts. I can give you enough to put him away. But I need something in return. Leave me the River Roadhouse and give me a 10% stake in Vance Woodworks." I looked at her, realizing she was not here out of regret. She was here because her husband was about to betray her, and she wanted to secure her spot on the winning side. "Let me think about it," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and left, not realizing I had not said yes. I sat in the quiet apartment after she left, the screenshot still on my phone. Clara had spent 6 years married to a man who saw her as a financial asset, and her first instinct upon discovering his betrayal was to negotiate a deal with me. She was still trying to trade information for property, still trying to secure her luxury lifestyle at my expense. She had not apologized for the Christmas dinner, or for the forged signature, or for the attempt to declare me incompetent. She had only offered to sell out her husband to save herself. I felt a cold, deep sadness. The daughter I had raised was gone, replaced by a negotiator who used her father's love as a bargaining chip. I forwarded the screenshots to Rebecca Finch, and I knew that this was the final piece we needed. Victor Marsh was going to prison, and Clara was going to find out that she could not negotiate her way out of her choices. Her attempt to trade Victor's laptop files for a corporate stake would not save her from the consequences of her own participation in his schemes. The next day, Rebecca Finch and I met with Dr. Linda Voss, a forensic document examiner. Her workspace was covered in light boxes, magnifiers, and digital imaging equipment. She had the $300,000 First Coastal Bank loan application laid out under magnification. "Sit down," Dr. Voss said, pointing to the screen. "The signature on the guarantor line was not produced by a human hand. It is a vectorized digital copy. Real signatures have micro-variations in speed and pressure. This signature has 0. It is too uniform." She then placed a high-resolution scan of a birthday card next to the signature. "This is the source," she said. The signature was lifted from this card. I looked at the screen. The card was the one I had sent to Clara for her 35th birthday. The inscription, written in my own hand, read, "Happy birthday, my darling daughter. No matter how old you get, I will always be standing behind you. Signed, Charles." Victor had taken that card from the living room mantel, photographed my signature, and used software to vectorize it and place it on the loan document. He had used my message of unconditional love to commit a federal crime. Betrayal is too small a word for what I felt. The words I had written with a good pen on a Sunday morning, meaning every word, had been used as a tool to steal from me. "Is this evidence admissible in court?" I asked. Dr. Voss nodded. "Yes, it meets the Dauber standard for expert testimony. The bank has more than enough grounds to file a criminal referral for forgery and bank fraud." I looked at Rebecca. "Proceed with the bank referral." She nodded. "I'll coordinate with the bank's legal team immediately, Charles. Under the California Penal Code Section 470, forgery is a serious offense, and when combined with bank fraud under 18 U.S. Code Section 1344, Victor was facing federal charges that carried significant prison time. The forensic report was absolute. Dr. Voss had documented the exact process Victor used to lift the signature, showing the pixel matches between the birthday card and the loan application. There was no defense. Victor could not claim I had signed the document, and he could not claim he had my authorization. Dr. Voss walked us through the technical details of her report, pointing to the pixel compression artifacts and the vector alignments on the high-resolution monitor. Real signatures show variation in ink flow, she explained. When a pen moves across paper, the pressure changes, leaving more ink in some places and less in others. This digital copy is flat. It is a perfect mathematical copy of the signature on the birthday card, right down to the microscopic stray ink mark from your old fountain pen. Victor didn't even clean up the image file before placing it on the PDF. It's a lazy forgery, Charles, but that's what makes it so easy to prove in court. Rebecca Finch turned to me, her notebook open. Under Virginia Code Section 18.2172, forgery and uttering are Class 5 felonies, each carrying up to 10 years in prison. But because this involves a commercial banking institution and federal funds, the federal prosecutor will likely take jurisdiction under the bank fraud statute, 18 U.S. Code Section 1344. That carries a maximum penalty of 30 years and up to a $1,000 fine. The Dauber standard requires that the forensic methodology be scientifically validated and peer-reviewed. Dr. Voss's report is fully compliant. We have the software logs, the pixel comparison charts, and the original birthday card which we will subpoena from the River Road estate. Victor has nowhere to run. During the meeting, Dr. Voss also showed us the scanned logs from Victor's design office computer, which the bank had retrieved through a civil discovery request. The logs showed that on October 14th at 11:22 p.m., a scanner registered to Marsh Design LLC had processed an image file titled Charles Signature Sword.jb at a resolution of 600 dpi. That file was a direct scan of the birthday card I had sent Clara. The software had then been used to extract the signature path and convert it to a vector graphic. This was not a simple mistake. It was a highly technical, deliberate act of forgery. Victor had spent hours refining the digital path to ensure it would pass the bank's automated scanners. He had not anticipated that a human examiner would compare the digital file to my physical signature cards on file at our commercial division. Furthermore, Dr. Voss explained that the bank had compared the digital hash of the signature block to my previous signature cards from 1995, 2003, and 2011. Under their internal security protocols, any high-value commercial guarantee requires a multi-generational signature audit. Because the digital copy had 0.999 similarity to the birthday card scan, but zero pressure variations, the system flagged it as an artificial match. A real signature is never exactly identical to a previous one. There are always micro-variations. Victor's attempt to make it perfect was his downfall. I stood up and thanked Dr. Voss. As we walked out of the building, Rebecca Finch looked at me. "This is the end of the line for him, Charles," she said. "The bank will submit the criminal referral by the end of the week. The federal investigators under FBI Special Agent Davis will take over from there." I nodded, looking at the city streets. I felt no joy, only a quiet solemn sense of completion. The work Martha and I had started in that Richmond workshop was finally protected, not by my hands, but by the clean, unyielding power of the law. I had spent decades shaping wood, learning its limits and its strengths, and I had finally learned that the law is the only tool that can shape a chaotic world. I was ready for the end. I knew the investigation would take time, but the foundation of our case was solid. Victor had used my signature as a key to my assets, but that key had turned in the lock and trapped him inside his own crime. The legal machinery was moving, and it would not stop until justice was served. The meeting was set for March 12th, the anniversary of Martha's death, at the first 400-square-foot workshop where we had started the business. I chose this location because I wanted the final confrontation to happen in the room that knew the truth. George Miller and I arrived early, setting up 2 long tables down the center of the dusty space. Victor and Clara arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, accompanied by their attorney and a notary. Victor was dressed in a sharp suit, carrying his leather portfolio, looking confident. Clara looked pale but composed. Victor shook my hand, his grip firm. "Thank you for doing this, Charlie," he said. "It's the right choice." We sat down, and Victor's attorney slid the revised transfer agreement across the table. I picked up the document, turned to the signature page, and signed my name. Victor let out a long breath, a victorious smile spreading across his face. "Excellent," he said, reaching for the paper. "If we can get the notary to—" "One moment," I said. "Before we notary, could you read the final page aloud, Victor? I want to make sure everyone hears the language." Victor's attorney frowned, but the notary picked up the page and began to read. Her voice faltered after a few words. The page was not a transfer authorization. It was a voluntary disclosure statement, confirming that Victor and Clara Marsh had willingly presented these corporate documents, including the forged loan applications. In the presence of witnesses, the workshop doors opened. Rebecca Finch walked in, followed by George Miller and two federal investigators from the Financial Crimes Division. Victor stood up so fast, his chair toppled over, crashing onto the concrete floor. He looked at me, his face stripped of all his smooth, calculated machinery. He was just a man who had lost. Clara stared at me, tears streaming down her face. "Dad," she whispered. "Mr. Marsh," one of the investigators said, stepping forward. "I'd like to ask you some questions." I stood up, walked to the small counter, and poured myself a cup of coffee. The legal machinery had finally caught up with Victor Marsh. Outside the workshop, a cold, freezing rain was falling, beating a steady rhythm against the metal siding. Victor's expensive leather dress shoes had been ruined by the muddy path leading from his locked car to the entrance, a small detail that felt oddly satisfying. Clara had looked around the dusty, drafty space, her eyes lingering on the old workbench in the corner where I used to set her when she was 5 years old. She had looked at the small wooden pencil holder she had carved for me in middle school, which still sat on the shelf, covered in a thin layer of sawdust. I saw a flash of real pain in her face, a realization of what she had traded for the River Road mansion and the designer purses. She had traded this room, this honest labor, for a man who was planning to leave her with $500,000 of debt. I did not look away. I watched her, letting the silence of the room speak for me. Victor's lawyer, a man named Mr. Cole, tried to intervene, raising his voice and claiming that the investigators had no jurisdiction in a private corporate matter. But Rebecca Finch calmly presented him with the federal warrant and the criminal referral from First Coastal Bank's board. Mr. Cole had looked at the documents, his face hardening, and then looked at Victor. "Shut up, Victor," he said quietly. "Don't say another word." Victor had stared at him, then at the handcuffs in the investigator's hand, his confidence completely vanishing. He was no longer the successful designer. He was a federal defendant. The workshop itself was cold, the old machinery stand silent in the shadows. The joiners, the table saws, the hand planes. They were the same ones Martha and I had purchased in 1988, our hands worn raw from the work. Victor had never stepped foot in this room before today. He had always refused to visit, claiming the dust was bad for his suits. But now he was trapped in the very space he had disdained, surrounded by the physical evidence of the labor he had tried to steal. George Miller stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching Victor with a quiet, unyielding satisfaction. George had spent 30 years protecting the shop, and he wasn't about to let a thief walk away with it. The notary had finished reading the document, her voice shaking, and she set it down on the table. The investigators were already moving Victor toward the door, his hands behind his back. The storm was finally over, and the workshop had witnessed the final truth. I walked to the window, watching them lead him to the unmarked sedan in the gravel lot. He was shouting at his lawyer, his face red, but the rain drowned out his words. Clara stood in the middle of the room, looking at the floorboards, her shoulders trembling. She had tried to buy a life with forged signatures and stolen lumber, but she had ended up in the dirt path where she started. I did not offer to hold her. I just drank my coffee, feeling the quiet strength of the old workshop surrounding me. The wood under my hands was warm, and it remembered the tree it came from, holding the light of the sun long after the forest was gone. We had a new foundation now, and this time we would build it to last. I looked at the old tools on the wall, the planes, the saws, the chisels. They were simple, but they were honest, and they had built everything I owned. Victor had tried to bypass the labor, to steal the value without doing the work, but the workshop had rejected him. I turned to Clara, who was still standing by the table, and I felt a small, cold spark of hope. The reckoning had come, and now we would find out what was left when the lies were gone. The legal process moved steadily. By the end of March, Victor was in federal custody, and in October, he was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for bank fraud and forgery under federal sentencing guidelines. Sandra Webb, the secondary warehouse accountant, was arrested and confessed to her role in the embezzlement scheme in exchange for a lighter sentence. Clara's attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement. Since she had signed 47 falsified damaged goods reports, she faced civil liability but avoided prison by providing all of Victor's laptop files and text messages to the prosecution. Clara moved out of the River Road estate and into a small, shared apartment downtown, paying $650 a month from her own marketing salary. She had lost the house, the designer clothes, and her wealthy social circle. But for the first time, she was paying her own way. I restructured the company ownership, transferring 51% of Vance Woodworks into an employee trust controlled by a council of 7 long-term workers, and 20% into a training fund named for Martha. Clara received no management role and no ownership, only a limited living stipend conditional on her continuing employment and repayment of the outstanding lease fees. In December, 3 weeks before Christmas, I was working in the old workshop when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Clara standing in the cold, holding a small wooden chair wrapped in burlap. She was wearing a plain coat, her hair pulled back in a simple elastic band, looking tired but more herself than she had in years. "I made this," she said softly. "Can I come in?" I stepped back. She set the chair on the workbench and unwrapped it. It was a simple pine-side chair, the mortise and tenon joints solid, but the front left leg was slightly short, making it rock. "I didn't come to ask for anything, Dad," she said, her voice cracking. "I wanted you to have this because it's the first thing I've made with money I earned myself." I set the chair on the floor, looked at it, and then looked at her. "The left leg is short," I said. "About 3 millimeters. "I know," she whispered. "Tomorrow you'll fix it," I said. She nodded. No argument, no negotiation. I went to the kettle and poured 2 mugs of tea, sitting down on the floor beside her in the quiet workshop. It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. A revenged dad takes back what's his, but family justice gives something back, too. The chance to start over on honest terms. The legal process moved steadily. By the end of March, Victor was in federal custody, and in October, he was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for bank fraud and forgery under federal sentencing guidelines. Sandra Webb, the secondary warehouse accountant, was arrested and confessed to her role in the embezzlement scheme in exchange for a lighter sentence. Clara's attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement. Since she had signed 47 falsified damaged goods reports, she faced civil liability but avoided prison by providing all of Victor's laptop files and text messages to the prosecution. Clara moved out of the River Road estate and into a small, shared apartment downtown, paying $650 a month from her own marketing salary. She had lost the house, the designer clothes, and her wealthy social circle, but for the first time she was paying her own way. I restructured the company ownership, transferring 51% of Vance Woodworks into an employee trust controlled by a council of 7 long-term workers and 20% into a training fund named for Martha. Clara received no management role and no ownership, only a limited living stipend conditional on her continuing employment and repayment of the outstanding lease fees. In December, 3 weeks before Christmas, I was working in the old workshop when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Clara standing in the cold, holding a small wooden chair wrapped in burlap. She was wearing a plain coat, her hair pulled back in a simple elastic band, looking tired but more herself than she had in years. "I made this," she said softly. "Can I come in?" I stepped back. She set the chair on the workbench and unwrapped it. It was a simple pine side chair, the mortise and tenon joints solid, but the front left leg was slightly short, making it rock. "I didn't come to ask for anything, Dad," she said, her voice cracking. I wanted you to have this because it's the first thing I've made with money I earned myself. I set the chair on the floor, looked at it, and then looked at her. The left leg is short, I said. About 3 millimeters, I know, she whispered. Tomorrow. You'll fix it, I said. She nodded, no argument, no negotiation. I went to the kettle and poured 2 mugs of tea, sitting down on the floor beside her in the quiet workshop. It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. A revenge dad takes back what's his, but family justice gives something back too, the chance to start over on honest terms. We sat there in the quiet workshop, drinking the tea, and I felt a small, warm spark of hope. Clara had spent 3 years trying to take what I owned, but tonight, she had brought me something she had built herself, imperfect and short in the leg, but real. It was the first honest transaction we had had in a decade, paid for not with my credit card, but with her own hours and calluses. Martha would have been proud of the joinery on that chair, even with the short leg, and she would have been proud of me for holding the line. I looked at Clara, her head resting against the workbench, and I knew that the storm was finally over. We had a long way to go, but we were starting in the right place, in the room where it all began, with the smell of sawdust and the quiet sound of the winter wind outside. The wood under our hands was warm, and it remembered the tree it came from, holding the light of the sun long after the forest was gone. We had a new foundation now, and this time we would build it to last.